Beneath the shade of apple trees, where laughter should have echoed, only silence grew. In 1871, an orchard hid not fruit, but Graves' children's bones resting beneath the roots of prosperity. Was it murder, madness, or something far darker? Stay with me, subscribe, and hit the bell, because tonight we're unearthing the Whitaker orchard's buried truth. The year was 1871, a time when America was still reeling from the Civil War. Communities across the Midwest were fragile, scarred by loss, desperate for stability, and eager for any promise of prosperity. Small farming towns were like self-contained worlds, where every family knew the other's business, and survival often depended on trust and cooperation. Against this backdrop, the Whitaker family appeared almost like a blessing. They weren't poor drifters like so many families displaced by war. They were educated, relatively wealthy, and ambitious. With them, they carried something rare: imported fruit trees, apple and peach varieties said to grow sweeter and faster than the local stock. To a town weary of shortages and failed harvests, the Whitakers' orchard project was more than farming. It was a promise of abundance, a vision of a future where their children would never go hungry again. At first, the community welcomed them with cautious admiration. The Whitakers purchased a wide stretch of fertile land just outside the town center. Soon, neat rows of saplings dotted the soil. Each spring, the orchard blossomed with flowers, and each autumn, it bore fruit that was healthier, larger, and more plentiful than anyone else's. It didn't take long for whispers to begin. How had outsiders achieved what generations of local farmers had failed to accomplish? The patriarch, Elias Whitaker, carried himself with authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed always in a formal coat, he gave the impression of a man meant for leadership. He spoke with conviction, his voice deep and deliberate, and people listened, even when they didn't entirely trust him. His wife, Margaret, was quieter. Locals described her as pale, soft-spoken, and always with a distant look in her eyes, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. Then there were the Whitaker children, 3 of them. Thomas, the eldest at 12, was sometimes seen at the general store, his posture already mirroring his father's. Eliza, 10, was polite, but rarely spoke more than a whisper. And the youngest, Caleb, no older than 6, had a wildness about him, always darting off, if not held by the hand. But after that first year, the townsfolk began to see less and less of them. The orchard became the family's entire world. Neighbors noted that even on Sundays, when church was practically a requirement, the Whitakers often stayed behind, claiming the orchard demanded their attention. At first, this was excused as the dedication of hard-working newcomers. But soon, their absence became a topic of gossip. There were other oddities, too. Visitors remarked on how quickly the trees seemed to grow, as if nourished by something more than sunlight and soil. The fruit was so perfectly formed that it almost looked unnatural. Some said it was signs Elias had studied agricultural methods in Europe. Others whispered of stranger things: rituals performed under the moon, prayers not spoken in the church. And then there were the nights. Farmers working late in their fields reported seeing lamplight flickering deep within the orchard long after midnight. Once or twice, travelers passing by swore they heard children laughing among the trees, though the Whitaker children hadn't been seen in weeks. The sheriff dismissed such claims as imagination, but the stories spread anyway. By the fall of 1871, the Whitakers' success had turned from admiration to suspicion. While other farmers struggled with blight and insects, their orchard remained untouched, pristine as if under some invisible protection. Locals began to mutter behind closed doors. What bargain had the Whitakers struck to achieve such perfection? But suspicion alone wasn't enough to break the town's silence. In those days, communities often looked the other way as long as prosperity flowed. And for a time, the Whitakers' orchard seemed to promise more prosperity than anyone dared question aloud. Yet, Beneath the outward image of growth and abundance, something darker was already taking root. The orchard was not just bearing fruit, it was beginning to bear secrets. At first, the townsfolk ignored the peculiarities of the Whitakers' orchard. Fruit was fruit, and good harvests were too rare to question. But as the seasons turned, the orchard began to carry with it a reputation that was difficult to shake. People started to notice things small, unsettling details that didn't quite fit into the rhythm of ordinary farm life. It began with the children. The Whitaker children were once a familiar sight, seen running errands in town or attending lessons with the local schoolteacher. But as months passed, their appearances grew fewer, until one day they simply stopped showing up altogether. Elias Whitaker explained it away, claiming his children were receiving private tutoring at home. Yet the schoolteacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Dalton, confided to others that she had never seen any books, slates, or papers delivered to the Whitaker home. And then there were the nights. Farmers who worked late into the evening described an unsettling glow coming from deep within the orchard. Lanterns or something like lanterns moved steadily among the trees long past midnight. At times, neighbors swore they heard voices drifting on the night air. Not conversations, but laughter. Children's laughter. The sound carried far, too far for comfort, and often when the Whitaker children hadn't been seen for weeks. One farmhand, a man named Jonas Miller, claimed he saw something more disturbing. While working near the orchard's edge at dusk, he noticed freshly turned soil among the roots of several trees. At first, he thought Elias was simply preparing the ground for new saplings. But half buried in the dirt, Jonas swore he glimpsed a child's shoe. When he told others in town, most dismissed him as drunk or trying to stir trouble. But Jonas quit his job the very next day and left town entirely within the week. He never returned. Even the fruit itself began to trouble people. Townsfolk whispered that the apples from the Whitaker orchard were too perfect, their skins flawless, their flesh unusually sweet. One woman claimed she sliced into a peach and found the inside unnaturally red, almost as if it bled. While most dismissed it as a tall tale, enough doubt lingered that some families quietly stopped buying Whitaker fruit. The orchard, once a symbol of growth, slowly became a place children were warned to avoid. Parents would hush their little ones if they wandered too close to its edges. The younger generation began spinning ghost stories, tales of shadows between the trees, or pale faces that vanished when you looked too long. Still, no one confronted the Whitakers directly. In small towns of the 19th century, privacy was respected, even when it bordered on secrecy. People would gossip in hushed tones at church gatherings or in the general store. But Elias Whitaker's stern presence and commanding voice made most unwilling to question him. Better to keep your suspicions to yourself than risk becoming the target of his wrath. But the rumors kept growing. Some said the Whitakers were involved in strange practices, rituals tied to the old world, prayers not heard in the town's church. Others whispered that Elias had struck a bargain, trading something unspeakable in exchange for the orchard's unnatural prosperity. And then there was Margaret Whitaker. Unlike her husband, she rarely spoke in public, and when she did, her words were often cryptic. One neighbor remembered Margaret murmuring that the trees needed feeding. Another recalled her warning a group of children to stay away from the roots, for they drink more than rain. By the winter of 1870, the orchard had ceased to be a place of admiration. It was, instead, a place of dread. Families crossed the road to avoid walking too near its boundary. Travelers passing through the area often remarked on its silence, the way the orchard seemed to swallow sound, as though the trees themselves were listening. The Whitakers, meanwhile, grew more reclusive. They rarely attended church, avoided town gatherings, and eventually stopped inviting neighbors to their home. Their isolation only fueled speculation. What were they hiding? Why did the orchard seem more alive at night than during the day? Whispers turned into warnings. Children dared each other to sneak into the orchard under moonlight, but few ever returned with proof of their bravery. Most would come back pale-faced, swearing they heard giggles in the dark or saw shapes moving between the trunks. And then, one by one, those children who once dared began to vanish. By the spring of 1870, the unease surrounding the Whitaker orchard had grown too heavy to ignore. The rumors, the strange lights, the unsettling laughter at night, all of it painted a picture too dark to dismiss. And then the vanishings began. At first, it was the Whitaker children themselves. For months, no one had seen Thomas, Eliza, or little Caleb in town. The excuse of private tutoring wore thin, especially as the children stopped appearing even in the fields near the orchard. Margaret Whitaker, once occasionally spotted at market with her children at her side, now came alone, her figure thinner, her eyes hollow. When asked about the children, she smiled faintly and said, "They're safe at home," but her voice carried no warmth, and no one dared press her further. By late summer, townsfolk began whispering that the Whitaker children were already gone swallowed by the orchard itself. Some said Elias had sent them away to relatives. Others claimed darker things, that the children's laughter heard at night was not living laughter, but echoes. Then came the disappearance of a child who was not a Whitaker. A farmer's daughter, 8-year-old Mary Ellen Carter, vanished on her way home from school. Her path took her near the edge of the Whitaker orchard. She was never seen again. Search parties scoured the fields, streams, and barns for miles, but the orchard remained strangely untouched. Few dared to step inside its boundaries, and Elias refused anyone permission to cross his land. He claimed ignorance, insisting his family knew nothing, but suspicion had already taken root. The timing was too cruel to ignore. One family's children vanished from sight, and now another's child disappeared near their land. The town grew restless, voices rising in anger and fear. Still, no proof was ever found. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no trace at all. The vanishings did not stop there. Over the next year, 2 more children from neighboring farms disappeared without explanation. A boy named Samuel, last seen tending animals near dusk. A little girl named Clara, who went missing while playing outside her home. Both lived within walking distance of the Whitaker orchard. Both vanished as though plucked from the earth. Each time, Elias Whitaker denied involvement. He grew more hostile, more defiant, warning the townsfolk to keep away from his property. Margaret, once timid, now seemed haunted, her face pale as chalk, her hands trembling as if with some unspoken knowledge. By the winter of 1870, the Whitaker family had almost completely withdrawn. The house windows were shuttered, the orchard unvisited by outsiders, the family rarely seen. The orchard itself, however, seemed alive. Neighbors swore the trees bloomed too early, bearing fruit when no other orchards did. In the still of night, the air carried strange scents, sickly sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with something coppery. Then, in early 1871, the Whitakers themselves vanished. It happened suddenly. One morning, smoke no longer rose from the chimney of their farmhouse. The doors hung slightly ajar, the animals untended, the orchard eerily quiet. A neighbor, suspicious after days without sight of Elias or Margaret, finally gathered courage and entered the house. What he found only deepened the mystery. The table was set for 5, with plates still arranged as if awaiting the children. The food on the plates had rotted, untouched. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, but cold. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. It was as if the entire family had stood up and walked away, and yet the orchard seemed untouched by their absence. Its trees still bore fruit in abundance, heavy and shining, even though no one was there to tend them. The town, now gripped by fear, debated whether to burn the orchard or leave it to rot. But before any decision could be made, nature or fate forced their hand. That autumn, when laborers attempted to cut down several trees for timber, their shovels struck something beneath the soil. Something not made of wood or stone, ... The discovery came not with a shout, but with a shovel's dull clang. In the fall of 1871, with the Whitaker family gone and their land abandoned, a small group of townsmen gathered to decide what to do with the orchard. Some argued it should be cleared and resold, the profits helping the struggling town. Others warned it should be left untouched, that nothing good could come from disturbing cursed soil. In the end, practicality won. The trees were worth money, and money was in short supply. So one cold morning, several laborers set to work, cutting down the first rows of trees. It was then that a spade hit something beneath, the roots of an older apple tree. At first, the men thought it was stone, but as the dirt gave way, pale fragments emerged, small, curved, and unmistakably human. A skull. The orchard fell silent. No birds called, no wind stirred. One of the men dropped his shovel and backed away, crossing himself. Another ran for the sheriff. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. Bones had been found beneath the Whitakers' orchard. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Abner Collins, arrived with a handful of deputies. They set to work carefully unearthing the site. What they found confirmed the townsfolk's worst fears. Beneath the roots lay the remains of a child. The small skeleton, curled unnaturally, was clothed in tattered fabric that might once have been a nightdress. The bones were brittle, but some still bore the faint outline of bindings around the wrists. And it didn't end there. As the men dug deeper, they uncovered not one, but several shallow graves, each holding the remains of children. Some were buried individually, others in pairs, as if hastily placed in the ground. Tiny shoes, rusted buttons, and fragments of cloth still clung to the bodies, grim reminders that these were not strangers. They were someone's sons and daughters. Word spread quickly. Families who had lost children in the past years rushed to the orchard, dreading that they might find closure. Some collapsed at the sight, weeping openly. Others cursed the Whitaker's name, demanding their memory be erased from the town forever. But the horror only deepened as more graves were uncovered. Not all of the remains matched the Whitaker children. In fact, several sets of bones were far too old to belong to them. The sheriff counted at least a dozen distinct skeletons, though the orchard seemed to stretch on endlessly, hinting that many more could lie beneath its soil. Some belonged to children reported missing from neighboring towns, families who had traveled through and never returned. Theories swirled like wildfire. Some believed Elias Whitaker had murdered his own children, burying them beneath the orchard as punishment or worse, as sacrifice. Others insisted Margaret was complicit, her mutterings about feeding the roots suddenly taking on a sinister new meaning. Still, others whispered that the Whitakers themselves had been victims, drawn into something older than them, something tied to the land itself. Some settlers recalled stories passed down from native tribes who had refused to build near that stretch of earth, calling it the soil of the lost. Perhaps the Whitakers had only uncovered what was already there and become part of it. The sheriff ordered a full investigation, but evidence was scarce. The Whitaker house yielded no bodies, no written confessions, no signs of violence. Everything pointed back to the orchard, and the orchard alone. For weeks, laborers dug, and the number of graves grew. The soil seemed bottomless, each tree with its own secret buried beneath its roots. It became clear that this was not just a crime scene. It was a graveyard disguised as farmland. By the time winter snow fell, the orchard had been reduced to a scarred landscape of open pits and skeletal remains. The town buried the children in a communal grave, a stone marker placed above it. To the innocents, taken before their time. But the name Whitaker was never inscribed. The orchard itself was left in ruin. Some called for it to be burned to ash, but others feared that fire might only unleash whatever darkness lingered there. In the end, it was abandoned, the stumps left to rot, the ground left bare. And yet, even stripped of its trees, the land never lost its sense of dread. Farmers swore nothing would grow there. Children dared each other to run across it at night, but most refused, claiming they heard voices calling from beneath the soil. The orchard had concealed its secrets well. But once unearthed, those secrets became the town's burden, a shadow that would never fully fade. Sheriff Abner Collins had handled his share of dispute-stolen livestock, drunken brawls, the occasional runaway, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the orchard. As the bones piled up, so too did the questions, and the sheriff found himself caught between a grieving town demanding justice and a silence that hung heavy over every clue. The first matter was identification. Some skeletons were small enough to clearly be children, while others seemed to belong to young teens. Clothing scraps were brought to families who had reported missing children, but decay blurred certainty. The Whitaker children were presumed among them, though no one could say for sure. Without photographs or modern records, everything hinged on memory, and memory was fragile, especially when grief twisted it. The second matter was motive. Why bury children beneath fruit trees? Why hide them in shallow graves instead of disposing of them elsewhere? Some townsfolk speculated Elias Whitaker had grown cruel, punishing his children for disobedience until death claimed him. Others believed Margaret, described by many as fragile and not right in the head, might have smothered the children in madness. But then came accounts that suggested something darker. A midwife named Hester Lowe came forward, her voice shaking as she confessed to an incident she had kept secret for years. Margaret Whitaker had once summoned her to the house late at night, claiming to have miscarried. But when Hester arrived, she was turned away by Elias himself, his face cold, his tone sharp. There's no need. We'll manage. She never saw a baby, nor Margaret, again that night. Now, standing before the sheriff, she admitted she had always wondered if what happened in that house was no miscarriage at all, Dot. Others whispered of rituals. A peddler traveling through town claimed he saw Elias alone among the orchard trees at midnight, chanting words the man swore were not English. A neighbor's son told of sneaking close one evening and seeing Elias standing with arms outstretched, as if praying, while Margaret knelt at his side, digging into the soil with bare hands. More troubling still were the bones themselves. Several of the skeletons bore markings, shallow grooves along the ribs and limbs, as if carved with a knife. Some thought it the careless work of shovels striking the remains during burial. Others believed it deliberate, ritualistic. Theories divided the town. The murder theory. Elias, a tyrant, had killed his children, and perhaps others who crossed his path. Margaret, too frightened or too broken to stop him, helped bury the evidence. The madness theory. Margaret, isolated and unwell, killed the children in fits of delusion, believing she was protecting them from unseen evils. Elias, bound by shame and pride, covered her crimes. The ritual theory. Both parents participated in some kind of practiced spiritualism, occult rites, or worse, feeding the orchard with blood to ensure its unnatural prosperity. The perfect fruit, the uncanny growth, the abundance when others starved. Was it coincidence? Or a bargain sealed in soil? The cursed land theory. Some older settlers insisted the Whitakers had never been killers at all, but victims. The orchard land, they said, had always been poisoned. Native tribes avoided it, claiming it was a place where the lost children wandered. Perhaps the Whitakers, ignorant of its history, had been consumed by whatever haunted it. The truth remained elusive. The sheriff's notes, preserved in fragments, speak of frustration. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence disappeared. And just as the investigation seemed to gain momentum, a fire broke out in the county courthouse. It destroyed ledgers, testimonies, and records, everything tied to the Whitaker case. Many whispered the fire was no accident. Some said Elias had powerful friends who wanted the matter buried. Others believed the orchard itself had claimed the evidence. As it had claimed the children. By winter's end, no charges were filed. The Whitakers, vanished into thin air, could not defend themselves or be punished. The investigation ended in silence, leaving only whispers and fear behind. Yet the revelations lingered. Families who once prided themselves on knowing their neighbors admitted that for years they had looked away, excusing the Whitakers' oddities because their fruit brought profit. Ministers preached about sin festering in secrecy. Mothers held their children closer, warning them never to wander near strange land. Still, the orchard kept its secrets. Even stripped bare, even rotting, the soil seemed unwilling to let go of its dead. Men working the land swore they heard whispers at dusk. A laborer claimed his shovel struck something soft, not bone, not stone, but something that felt alive beneath the dirt. He never returned to the site. The official story closed with the courthouse fire. But the unofficial one, the one whispered in kitchens, told in hushed tones to children at bedtime, was far from finished. For those who had seen the orchard graves, there was no forgetting, and for some, there was no forgiveness. When the digging finally stopped and the graves were filled once more, the town breathed a sigh of relief, but it was not the relief of resolution. It was the relief of exhaustion, of people who could no longer bear to look at what they had uncovered. The orchard was abandoned, left as a scar on the land, but the memory of what had been found there clung to the town like rot that would not wash away. Families who had lost, children lived with the torment of half-answers. The communal grave offered them somewhere to kneel, somewhere to weep, but it could not tell them which bones belonged to their loved ones. Mothers laid flowers on the earth, whispering names into the wind, while fathers stood stiff and silent, anger hardening into stone in their faces. But alongside grief, there was guilt. Many admitted, in hushed tones, that they had suspected something was wrong long before the discovery. They had noticed the absence of the Whitaker children, the strange lights in the orchard, the laughter that carried across the night air. They had heard the warnings in Margaret's voice, the rumors about Elias, and yet they had done nothing. In towns like theirs, where survival demanded minding one's own business, silence had been their shield. Now that silence felt like complicity, the church tried to frame the tragedy as a lesson. Ministers preached sermons about sin festering in secrecy, about the dangers of pride and envy. But some whispered that the church, too, had failed turning away from the Whitakers when they should have intervened, allowing isolation to breed whatever evil had taken root there. The orchard itself became a place of avoidance. Children were warned not to wander near it, though they needed little convincing. The land seemed wrong, heavy with a presence that made even the bravest hesitate. Farmers avoided buying the property, even when offered for a fraction of its worth. No crops took root there anyway. The soil refused to yield anything but weeds. Still, the stories persisted. Teenagers dared each other to enter the orchard at night, and some returned pale and shaken. They swore they heard children crying beneath the earth, or saw pale shapes darting between the stumps where trees once stood. One boy claimed he heard his sister's voice calling his name, though she had died years earlier in a fever. He never returned to the orchard again. Generations passed, and the details blurred, but the fear remained. By the turn of the century, locals no longer spoke of Elias or Margaret Whitaker directly. The family name was dropped from records, their story passed down only in fragments. Instead, people spoke simply of the orchard, as if the land itself was the guilty party. But guilt was not confined to memory. Descendants of those who had lived in the town during the Whitaker years carried their ancestors' silence like a stain. Some families refused to discuss it at all, while others whispered of curses, believing their own hardships were punishment for having looked the other way. The orchard stood as a physical reminder of that silence. Even stripped of its trees, even after years of abandonment, it never lost its reputation. Travelers were warned away. Farmers refused to till its soil. On maps, it was left unnamed, a blank patch of earth no one wanted to claim. And so the town learned to live with its secret, burying the truth in layers of guilt and silence, just as the Whitakers had buried bones beneath the trees. The graves might have been unearthed, but the deeper questions, the why, the how, the who, remained untouched. Some wounds heal with time, others fester. The Whitaker orchard was one of the latter. It became a wound the community carried quietly, pretending to forget, but never truly able to. And perhaps that is why, when the wind swept through the abandoned fields at night, some swore it carried the sound of children's laughter. Not playful, not innocent, but mocking. A reminder of what silence had cost them. History is filled with tragedies that make sense in hindsight, wars with causes, crimes with motives, disasters with explanations. But then there are stories, like the Whitaker's orchard, where the facts are clear enough to horrify, yet the truth remains tangled in shadows. More than a century has passed since bones were lifted from that soil, but the orchard has never been redeemed. Nothing grows there. Families still warn their children to avoid the place, though the trees are long gone. Some say the land itself remembers. Others believe it waits. The Whitakers themselves remain an enigma. Were Elias and Margaret cold-blooded killers who sacrificed innocence for prosperity? Was Margaret a mother broken by madness, burying her children in silence while her husband covered the truth? Or were they simply the latest victims of cursed land, swallowed whole by forces older than the town itself? No court records remain destroyed in the courthouse fire. No diaries, no letters, no last words from the family. What survives are whispers, fragments, and the bones of the innocent. Perhaps that is what makes the story so haunting. We cannot name the evil. And when evil cannot be named, it never truly dies. For the townsfolk who lived through it, silence was easier than answers. To speak of the orchard was to invite nightmares. And so the legend grew in the shadows, passed in hushed voices from one generation to the next. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Whitaker name had nearly disappeared, but the orchard remained in local lore, a reminder of the cost of ignoring the strange, the unsettling, the dangerous. And now, as you've walked through this story with me, I ask you, what do you believe? Do you think Elias Whitaker was a tyrant, murdering his own children to preserve power? Do you think Margaret, with her whispered warnings, was the one who fed the roots herself? Or do you think the truth is something darker, something buried still beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered again? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. And your theories keep these stories alive. If this story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, so you never miss the forgotten horrors we bring back from history's shadows. And please, share this video with someone who loves dark tales of mystery and the macabre, because history doesn't just live in books and records. Sometimes it lingers in the soil, in the trees, in the silence left behind. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right, you can still hear the orchard laughing.